When I first stumbled upon the abandoned mountain house, it looked like something straight out of a ghost story, with ivy creeping up the stone walls, broken shutters clinging desperately to rusted hinges, and a roof that sagged like the weary shoulders of a man carrying burdens far too long. Yet something about it spoke to me in a way that no polished suburban property ever had. It was isolated on a ridge overlooking a vast stretch of pine forest, with a view so wide and clear you could almost trace the curvature of the earth. And despite the decay, I saw the potential for a sanctuary, a place to escape the noise of city life and build something meaningful with my own two hands. So when the opportunity came up to purchase it through a foreclosure sale, I jumped at it, securing the deed for a fraction of what the land alone was worth. And as I drove up that winding mountain road for the first official visit as its owner, my mind was filled with visions of sanding down old beams, replacing windows, breathing life back into every broken piece of the house until it felt alive again. What I didn't expect, however, was to find signs of recent habitation, smoke curling faintly from the chimney, footprints in the snow leading up to the porch, and a car, a beat-up silver sedan, parked discreetly behind a cluster of trees, as though someone had tried to hide it from plain view. And when I unlocked the creaky front door, the smell that hit me wasn't dust and mildew, but coffee, strong and freshly brewed, which immediately set alarm bells ringing in my head. Because this place was supposed to be abandoned for over a decade, according to county records, yet there I was, stepping into a foyer where a pair of women's boots sat neatly by the mat, a knitted scarf hung from the banister, and a purse rested casually on the table as though its owner had just stepped away for a moment. My heart raced, torn between the logical possibility that a squatter had taken up residence here and the absurd, nagging thought that maybe I had walked into the wrong house. But no, the brass plate on the door frame matched my paperwork. This was indeed mine. And as I ventured deeper into the living room, I heard the unmistakable sound of humming off-key but persistent coming from the kitchen, and when I turned the corner, I came face to face with her, a woman in her late 50s with tightly curled hair that looked like it had been sprayed into submission, wearing a pastel cardigan and holding a mug of coffee like she owned the place, and before I could even open my mouth, she fixed me with the kind of glare that could cut glass and demanded, "Excuse me, what are you doing in my home?" Which left me momentarily speechless, because the sheer audacity of the situation knocked the words right out of me. Yet, after a few seconds, I managed to stammer out that this was my house, that I had the deed in my car, that it had been abandoned until I purchased it, and that she had no right to be here. But instead of looking shocked or apologetic like a squatter might, she scoffed and waved her hand dismissively, insisting that she was part of the Mountain View HOA and that they had decided to repurpose this house since the original owners had left it to rot. So she had taken it upon herself to move in and maintain it on behalf of the association, a claim that was both absurd and infuriating because not only was there no mention of any active HOA in the property disclosures, but the county clerk had specifically told me that the community dissolved its association years ago when half the properties went vacant. Yet here she was, an HOA Karen if I'd ever seen one, squatting in my mountain retreat and talking as though she had some kind of authority over me. And the more she spoke, the more outrageous her lies became. She claimed she had already enforced regulations by redecorating the place. She called herself the interim president, and she even had the gall to suggest that if I wanted to stay, I would need to apply for HOA approval, pay dues, and follow her guidelines, which at that point made me realize I wasn't just dealing with a squatter. I was facing a delusional control freak who had found a crumbling house and decided to crown herself queen of the mountain, and as the fire crackled in the hearth she had commandeered, I felt my vision of peace and restoration slipping through my fingers, replaced with the cold reality that this was going to be a battle, not just to renovate the house, but to reclaim it entirely, because Karen wasn't going to leave quietly, and I had the sinking feeling that this confrontation was only the beginning of a long, ugly war. I stood there in stunned silence, gripping the strap of my backpack so tightly that my knuckles went pale, trying to wrap my head around the sheer boldness of this woman sitting at my kitchen table with her mug of coffee like she was hosting a brunch, and as she rambled on about her so-called HOA bylaws, I realized quickly that reasoning with her wasn't going to be easy. because every time I tried to explain ownership, she cut me off with condescending remarks, claiming that my deed was probably forged, or that paperwork doesn't override community rules, and it took every ounce of restraint not to laugh in her face, because the very idea of an HOA having jurisdiction over an abandoned mountain property was laughable. Yet the way she spoke, with absolute conviction and disdain, was infuriating, and I knew if I didn't handle this carefully, it could spiral out of control fast. So I pulled out my phone, opened the scanned deed I had saved, and laid it on the table for her to see, expecting at least a flicker of realization to cross her face, but instead she squinted at it, gave a theatrical sigh, and said, "Cute, but this doesn't mean anything here. This house belongs to the HOA now, and by extension to me." And with that, she casually sipped her coffee as though delivering a verdict from a throne. And that was the moment I knew I was dealing with someone who thrived on control, someone who probably bullied her suburban neighbors into repainting their shutters or cutting their lawns to regulation height. And now, having found this mountain refuge, she had crowned herself queen without anyone to stop her until now, because I wasn't about to lose the dream I had already invested my savings and hopes into, not to a squatter hiding behind imaginary authority. So I told her firmly, "You need to leave today. This house is mine. I bought it legally, and if you don't pack up your things, I'll have no choice but to involve the sheriff." But instead of being intimidated, she actually smirked and leaned back in her chair, saying, "Oh, honey, you don't want to do that. You have no idea who you're dealing with," which sent a chill down my spine, not because I believed she had real power, but because her confidence suggested she had some kind of plan, some twisted scheme she believed would keep her entrenched here. And sure enough, over the next few minutes, she laid it out in smug detail, explaining how she had files on the other abandoned properties, how she had reorganized the HOA paperwork to reinstate it herself, and how she could make my life miserable, with endless citations, fines, and compliance notices if I resisted, all of which was utterly baseless legally. But the sheer energy she put into spinning her web of nonsense was astonishing and, in a way, terrifying, because people like her often succeeded not through truth, but through persistence, through making so much noise that others gave up. Yet I wasn't about to roll over, not here, not on land I had dreamed about owning for years. So I stepped closer, looked her dead in the eye, and said in a voice calm but unshakable, "This is your final warning. You can leave now on your own terms, or you can wait until the sheriff drags you out. But either way, you're not staying here another week." And I turned, walked to the door, and motioned toward it, expecting her to at least start packing. But instead, she slammed her mug down, so hard coffee splashed onto the table and snapped. "Fine. Call the sheriff. You'll regret it when the entire community backs me up." Which was laughable given that the so-called community had long since withered away into scattered vacation cabins and foreclosed lots. But she said it with such venom that I could tell she genuinely believed reinforcements would arrive, and sure enough, the very next morning when I returned after spending the night at a nearby motel, I found not just her car still hidden behind the trees, but also two more vehicles in the driveway, both belonging to people who looked like her clones, middle-aged, stern-faced, clipboard-carrying types who greeted me with the exact same air of superiority and announced they were the HOA board here to conduct an emergency compliance inspection of my renovations that hadn't even started yet. And I swear for a moment I thought I had stumbled into some kind of bizarre parody, but their self-seriousness was too real to be a joke, and when I tried to tell them they had no jurisdiction, they shoved stacks of photocopied bylaws at me, full of absurd rules like all exterior paint colors must be pre-approved, firewood must be stacked no higher than 4 feet, and even chimney smoke output must not exceed HOA standards. And while part of me wanted to laugh at the insanity, another part of me realized that if these people had the gall to trespass and stage a fake HOA intervention, they might not stop until they completely sabotaged my plans, and that meant this was no longer just an annoyance. It was war, because I had come here to rebuild a mountain home, not to be bullied by suburban dictators in cardigans, and if they wanted to fight over who truly owned this place, then I was more than ready to give them one, armed not with their petty rules and photocopied nonsense, but with the law, the deed, and a determination they clearly hadn't expected to encounter. The so-called HOA board had planted themselves firmly on the porch by the time I returned later that afternoon with supplies, clipboards in hand, their faces etched with smug determination as if they were gatekeepers of some sacred institution, and as I set down my toolbox and tried to unlock the front door, one of them, a tall, wiry man with a comb-over and an expression that screamed superiority, stepped in front of me and declared, "Per HOA regulations, you're not permitted entry until this property is brought into compliance," which nearly made me burst out laughing at the absurdity of someone trying to deny an owner access to his own legally purchased home. But the way he said it with absolute certainty made it clear these people lived in their own alternate reality, and the woman, Karen herself, stood just behind him with arms folded, glaring at me like I was some intruder trespassing on her personal kingdom. So I held up my keys and the deed, waved them in their faces, and said in as steady a voice as I could manage, "I own this house, I bought it fair and square, and unless any of you have legal documentation proving otherwise, you need to get off my property before I call the sheriff." Yet instead of backing down, they exchanged smug glances and began rattling off fake violations, pointing to the chipped paint on the siding, the missing shingles on the roof, the cracked window in the upstairs bedroom, as though decades of weather damage somehow counted as me breaking their non-existent rules, and the ridiculousness of it all was almost too much to bear. But before I could respond, Karen stepped forward, jabbing her finger toward me and saying, "We warned you. Failure to comply with HOA mandates will result in fines and possible eviction," which was so outrageous. I couldn't even muster anger at first, only disbelief, because here she was, a squatter in my house, threatening to evict me, and I realized right then that arguing with them on the spot was pointless. So instead, I calmly pulled out my phone, dialed the county sheriff's office, and explained the situation as clearly as possible: that I had purchased a foreclosed mountain property, that I had the deed in hand, and that trespassers were refusing to leave while falsely claiming authority. And when the dispatcher assured me an officer would be sent up within the hour, I felt a surge of relief, thinking that surely the presence of law enforcement would shatter their little fantasy. But Karen only smirked when she overheard, leaning toward me with a smug smile and whispering, "Good luck with that. The sheriff's already familiar with our HOA. He'll back us up, not you," which made me wonder just how deep her delusion ran, because I knew from the county office that the HOA had been dissolved years ago, yet she spoke with such conviction it was almost like she believed she could will her lies into reality. And while we waited, the so-called board members refused to budge from the porch, scribbling notes onto their clipboards and muttering about non-approved landscaping as they eyed the patch of overgrown weeds by the driveway, until finally, after what felt like an eternity, a sheriff's SUV rumbled up the gravel road and parked behind my truck, the deputy stepping out with a weary look on his face, clearly not thrilled about making the trek up the mountain for what he probably assumed was a routine squatter dispute. And as soon as he approached, Karen rushed forward, waving her arms dramatically and launching into a tirade about how I was violating community codes and forging documents to steal HOA property, and I'll admit my stomach knotted for a moment, fearing he might actually entertain her nonsense. But when I handed over my deed, signed, sealed, and verified through the county, the deputy barely glanced at her stack of photocopied bylaws before handing them back and saying flatly, "Ma'am, this property legally belongs to him. There is no HOA registered for this area anymore," and the stunned silence that followed was sweeter than any victory I could have imagined, though it lasted only a second before Karen's face twisted into a mask of rage, her voice rising to a shrill screech as she accused the deputy of taking bribes, of conspiring against the community, of betraying his duty, and the other two clipboard warriors chimed in, waving their papers and demanding he respect their authority, but the deputy wasn't having it, his patience visibly thinning as he told them in no uncertain terms that if they didn't leave voluntarily, they'd be charged with trespassing, which should have been the end of it. But of course, Karen wasn't the type to go quietly. She crossed her arms, planted herself in the doorway, and snarled, "If you want me out, you'll have to drag me out." And for a tense few moments, I actually thought the situation might escalate into arrests right there on my porch, but instead the deputy sighed, warned them one last time, and finally, with much stomping and muttered threats, they retreated to their cars, glaring at me as though I had personally destroyed their kingdom, and as their engines faded down the road, I finally exhaled, the weight of the confrontation lifting just enough for me to step inside my house again, though the victory felt temporary, because I knew deep down that Karen wasn't finished, that people like her didn't just disappear after one failed power grab, and sure enough, as I began cleaning the kitchen later that evening, I noticed a stack of papers slipped under the door, fake compliance notices threatening daily fines, warning of lien placement on my property, and demanding I attend a mandatory HOA meeting the following weekend, all signed in bold ink by President Karen. And as I held those papers in my hands, the absurdity of it all struck me again, but so did the reality that this woman was willing to escalate her harassment into a full campaign, and if I didn't find a way to stop her decisively, she'd keep clawing at my dream until she either wore me down or forced me into a battle I hadn't anticipated. And that realization steeled me, because I wasn't about to let her or her fake board dictate the fate of the mountain house I had sacrificed so much to reclaim. The days that followed were like living inside a bizarre parody of suburban warfare transplanted to the wilderness, because every time I returned to the mountain house with supplies or tools, there was some fresh attempt by Karen and her self-appointed board to assert dominance over my property, and it was almost surreal watching them treat my rugged mountain retreat like it was just another cul-de-sac home in their imaginary HOA kingdom. One morning I found bright orange violation stickers plastered across the windows, citing infractions like failure to maintain curb appeal despite the fact there wasn't a curb within 10 miles of the ridge. Another day, I discovered a chain strung across my driveway with a sign declaring HOA residents only trespassers will be fined, which I cut down immediately with a hacksaw. And the following week, I caught one of her cronies photographing my lumber delivery like it was contraband, muttering about unauthorized materials as if I needed their permission to fix a roof, and each incident only fueled my determination, because while they thought intimidation and absurd bureaucracy would drive me out, they underestimated how much grit I had built up through years of setbacks in life, and they certainly didn't anticipate that every attempt they made only strengthened my resolve to put an end to their charade once and for all. So I decided to get methodical, documenting every absurd notice, taking pictures of every trespassing stunt, and compiling a file thick enough to not only prove harassment, but to make a mockery of their so-called authority. And at the same time, I threw myself into renovation, as if every nail I hammered and every board I replaced was a declaration of ownership louder than words, because while they were busy scribbling fake fines, I was breathing life back into the house, turning it into something beautiful again, and the more progress I made, the more furious Karen became, showing up at the edge of the property to yell accusations about non-compliant paint colors or illegal chimney smoke, her voice echoing through the pines like some demented town crier, until finally one afternoon she went so far as to march right onto the porch again, clipboard clutched like a weapon, and announce she was issuing me a final warning before the HOA would take legal action to reclaim the property, a threat that might have rattled someone else, but only made me smile grimly, because by then I had already scheduled a meeting with the county sheriff and the local magistrate to lay out everything I had gathered, and when I told her she'd soon be explaining herself to real authorities in a courtroom, the confident mask cracked just enough for me to glimpse the panic underneath, though she quickly covered it with another outburst, insisting that the community stands with me, which was laughable because most of the surrounding cabins were either empty or occupied by weekend hunters who couldn't care less about her fantasies, and in fact, one of those hunters, a grizzled, older man named Tom who had a place down the ridge, had already warned me he'd seen her snooping around other properties, leaving similar notices, and even moving patio furniture to enforce regulations, and he assured me I wasn't the first target of her power trip, though I might be the first willing to push back, and hearing that only steeled my resolve further. Because this wasn't just about my house anymore, it was about putting an end to her entire reign of harassment. So when the date of the magistrate meeting arrived, I walked into that small county office with my thick file of evidence under one arm, determined to lay it all out, and sure enough, there she was already waiting, dressed in her pastel cardigan like she was attending a church potluck, flanked by her two clipboard warriors, arms crossed, faces smug, as if victory was already assured, and when the magistrate asked for her side, she launched into a tirade about how the Mountain View HOA had been revived under her leadership, how I was a rogue homeowner refusing to comply with community rules, and how the property technically belonged to the collective, all of which might have sounded impressive, if not for the fact that every word fell apart the moment I presented the actual county records showing the HOA's dissolution years prior, the foreclosure documents showing abandonment, and finally the notarized deed, transferring ownership to me, and watching the magistrate lean back, rub his temples, and finally look over his glasses at her with an expression of exasperated disbelief was one of the most satisfying moments of my life, because when he said, "Ma'am, there is no legal HOA here, and you have no authority over this man's property," the room fell silent except for the sound of her sputtering in outrage, insisting she had bylaws, insisting the community needed her, insisting the house couldn't belong to me, because I didn't understand the vision, but none of it mattered anymore, not in the face of cold, hard law. And when the magistrate went further, issuing a formal warning that any further trespassing or harassment would result in criminal charges, the last shred of her smugness drained away, replaced by a crimson fury so intense I thought she might actually explode. Yet even then she couldn't concede defeat, storming out of the office with her cronies in tow, vowing over her shoulder that this isn't over, though everyone in the room knew it was, because her imaginary empire had just been dismantled in the only place that mattered, under the law. And as I drove back up the mountain afterward, the autumn sun sinking low over the ridges, painting the sky in fiery streaks of orange and red, I felt a wave of relief wash over me, not just because I had defended my ownership, but because the house, that beautiful broken refuge, was finally free of her grip, though a small part of me still braced for the possibility that she might try one last desperate stunt before slinking away for good. For a brief moment after the magistrate's ruling, I allowed myself to believe the nightmare was over, that Karen and her clipboard brigade would slink back down the mountain in defeat and leave me to the peace I had come here to find, but people like her don't give up quietly. And within days, the next phase of her campaign began, though this time it was more underhanded, less about open confrontation, and more about petty sabotage, because one morning I awoke to find nails scattered across my driveway, clearly meant to blow out my truck's tires, and later that same week I discovered a "for sale" by owner sign planted in my yard with her phone number scrawled across it, as if she were trying to lure potential buyers into calling her for some elaborate scam. And while none of these tricks could actually change ownership, they were constant reminders that she hadn't accepted defeat, that she was still lurking, still desperate to exert control over something that wasn't hers. So I decided to go on the offensive in a way she wouldn't expect, by fully embracing my role as the rightful steward of the property and renovating with such visible, undeniable progress that her delusion couldn't survive against the reality of what I was building. Every day, I hauled lumber, replaced beams, patched the roof, and painted the walls, documenting each step not just for my own satisfaction, but as proof that the house was mine and thriving under my care. And with each improvement, the house seemed to shrug off the years of neglect, its windows gleaming again, its frame solid against the mountain winds, its hearth warm with fire. And the more alive the house became, the more desperate Karen's antics grew, until finally she showed up one evening just as I was finishing work on the porch railing, her face twisted in rage, clutching another one of her infamous clipboards, and she screamed at me across the yard about how I had destroyed the character of the community and how the house would never truly belong to me, her voice carrying so far into the woods that even the crows startled and took flight. But I didn't rise to the bait. I simply leaned against the new railing, calm and steady, and told her the truth she had refused to face since day one. This was never your house, Karen. There is no HOA. There is no community presidency. All you did was squat in an abandoned place and pretend you had power. It's over. And the silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the wind in the pines, until finally her eyes glistened with something I had never expected to see: Tears, quickly masked by another burst of anger as she threw her clipboard to the ground, screamed that I had ruined everything and stormed down the driveway for what I knew in my gut would be the last time, because there was a finality in her departure, the kind of defeated slump in her shoulders that comes when even the most stubborn person finally accepts they've lost the war. And sure enough, weeks passed without another sighting, no more fake notices, no more trespassing board members, just silence and the sound of hammers and saws as I brought the mountain house back to life, until at last I stood on the porch one crisp morning, coffee in hand, staring out at the sunrise spilling golden light across the valley, and I realized the battle had given me something unexpected, a deeper connection to this place, forged not just through renovation, but through the fight to protect it. A reminder that peace is often something you have to fight for, to defend against those who would twist it into something ugly for their own control. And as the months rolled on, the house became everything I had dreamed of, a sanctuary of wood and stone and firelight, a refuge far from the chaos of the world. And though I sometimes still found myself half expecting to see a pastel cardigan appear at the edge of the trees, clipboard in hand, I knew deep down that Karen was gone, her empire of imaginary rules dissolved into nothing more than a bitter memory, and the land, the house, the quiet mountain air, all that was mine at last, unshackled, unchallenged, and free to grow into the home it was always meant to be.